Thank you guys for coming out. We have we have an intimate crowd here, and I appreciate you guys coming out to see my presentation. My name is Joseph Fox. I'm a historian over at the Museum of South Texas History. I've been down in the valley for about 10 months, so haven't made it through my first summer yet, but we'll see. I got my master's degree from Texas State University under the guidership of historians Dan Utley, Gary Hartman, and Jason Mallard, who've written on music from this era. So I was very lucky to I actually got on this subject in Dr. Jason Mallard's class on Texas music history. One day he said he knew a guy named Jerry Retzloff. He used to work for the Lone Star Brewing Company, and if anybody was crazy enough to take up that subject it could make a really good thesis. So I was crazy enough to do it because I like weird subjects. I guess you could call me a little bit of a cultural or a music historian, or but there's a big advantage. There's a big benefit. I think cultural, social, music history offers people, which is we're not just looking at. We shouldn't just look at the past through the lens of what the politicians are doing up in Washington or Austin. We should be also looking at how people are reacting to the changes that happen in our society, and I think in that way, cultural history can offer a mirror that allows us to understand ourselves as a society better. So that's kind of what got me into this, and this was a great this was a great subject. I got to do oral histories, a series of oral histories through Jerry Retzloff with a number of artists, musicians, Lone Star beermen, union workers, and other people connected with this very unique movement that happened in Texas. This is a poster called "Out of Hibernation." It was given to me by a artist with this group. He was affiliated with this music venue in Austin called the Armadillo World Headquarters, which was a hollowed out National Guard Army depot that was converted into a music venue that hosted a diverse range of musicians, from country to blues to jazz to all. They would even have ballets in this thing. It was this countercultural hippie place in Austin. But they used the armadillo as their symbol for this movement. And Sam Yates he started working with Lone Star Beer and made this poster that has a giant armadillo burrowing out of hibernation. And you can see the first thing he does is attack a Lone Star beer truck, steal the beer, and now he's heading off to downtown Austin as Budweiser's mascot, Spuds McKenzie, flees in the foreground in terror. Writing about this time, I guess my paper tries to understand. I look at three things. I look at the history of the Lone Star Brewing Company during this era. I look at progressive country, particularly this sort of blending of traditional country and counterculture music that was happening in the state in the early 70s. And I also look at this idea of the Texas Mystique, or what it means to be Texas. What it means to be Texan. And in the 1970s, this was an era when all three of those things were in flux. Some people refer to the 70s as the decade of malaise. There were a lot of changes happening in society that make for a lot of people look at the 60s and 70s as a decade with a lot of fun, but with a lot of change, social upheaval, you could even say. So this picture up here is a picture of Austin, downtown Austin, in the early 70s. Texas and the rest of the South was undergoing a urbanization. They call this the growth of the Sun Belt. This was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of people were moving down from the north, what they call the Frost Belt, areas where with the heavy automotive centers and moving down to the south, where a number of things and other new bits of technology made it easier to live. So you have mechanized farming, which allows more people to, it means you can do more work on the farms with less people. You have air conditioning, which air conditioning and refrigeration, which came out, which reached the South in the 1950s, which, believe you me, makes it a lot easier to live down here. Electricity, new forms of mass media, radio, television, and highways connecting large urban areas, making it easier to travel around the state. Politically, the 70s, across the South, in the 1970s, the area was switching from Democrat to Republican with the growth of the Sun Belt. Part influenced by conservatives moving down from the Frost Belt from up north, part influenced by Democrats switching party as a response to civil rights. In the foreground right here, you can see John Tower, who was the first Republican senator elected in 1961. He was the first Republican senator in Texas since Reconstruction. And you'll probably recognize the gentleman to his right. That's George H.W. Bush, who was elected congressman up around Harris County in 1966. You also have civil rights. You have the picture right here is a picture of the Ed Couch Elsa walkout, which happened in 1968. These were Mexican-American students walking out of school in protest of how Spanish-speaking people were treated by the public school system. There was huge mass movements protesting segregation. And you have, and as a result of that, you have legislation passed in the 1960s, which changed the face of the Deep South. You also have, in the late 60s, you also have the Vietnam War, which made, and with that, with the civil rights protests, you have the unraveling of what a lot of people called the New Deal consensus. This period where people had a lot of faith and confidence in the American political system kind of unravels a little bit. All it takes is something else, like the Watergate scandal to promote this sort of deep-rooted cynicism that really takes hold in the 1970s. With all these changes, there's also to long-term residents in Texas, there was a feeling that their state was changing, particularly with urbanization. There was a feeling that the state was changing in a way that they couldn't control. So here's a quote from a DJ for Coke FM, which was a radio station up in Austin. He says, in an interview with the author, he says, "Just wait a damn minute. I'm from Texas. I love Texas. It's a great place to live. I love the way we eat. I love the way we dress. I love our habits and our customs. And I love the way I talk. I love everything about the state, and why wouldn't I? It's a great place." So a couple pictures here. This is, so you could call, so first of all, what is progressive country? You could call it a blend of traditional country music and folk music with that emphasize like this sort of emphasis on roots, on heritage, on country. Folk and country musicians like this kind of see themselves as they're reenacting the spread of the American frontier, wagons rolling west, and farming and rural culture. Progressive country blended that, so now you have steel guitar and electric instruments in the band, but also counterculture, but also countercultural, a sort of rebellious outlook. Saying that we're protesting the war in Vietnam because we are Texans, because we're like our troublemaking ancestors that moved out here. Probably the biggest, there are a number of bands that personified this movement. You can see Willie Nelson at one of his famous 4th of July picnics on this picture right here. He probably crossed the bridge between working class oil businessmen and oil field workers and in this sort of hippie countercultural movement that was in Austin at the time. And he still has this weird ability to appeal to everybody on both sides. And some people even referred to progressive country as a alliance between hippies and rednecks. You also have blending in other ways. Down in this corner right here, you have Doug Somm, who was a country, you could call him a country rock musician. His band, the Sir Douglas Quintet, blended. They were like a Tex-Mex rock and roll band. They originally. And they came out in the 60s, and they used the term the Sir Douglas Quintet as like a nod to the Beatles, to Beatlemania that was going on. But Doug Somm, with playing with people like Augie Myers and Flaco Jimenez, blends together a number of music traditions in Texas, mainly like rock and roll with German and Mexican polka. So this brings me to the Armadillo World headquarters. So there's a picture of the inside of the place. It's like I said, a reinvented National Guard armory with a stage inside, complete with a beer garden for people to relax and enjoy their drinks outside. They also adopted the armadillo as a symbol for their movement, arguing that the armadillo this is from the words of artist Jim Franklin. The armadillo is like he's a scavenger who's just wants to do his own thing, but he's always wandering out on the highway and getting run over by traffic. So in the same way that armadillos are victims of modernity, their hippies are also. So this brings us to the second thread of my paper, beer, Lone Star Beer in particular. Lone Star Beer began its production in San Antonio in 1884, and it was originally it was transplanted. It was opened up by a guy named Adolphus Busch from Anheuser-Busch as a brewing company that could use modern brewing technology in terms of like storage and mass production to compete against local markets. It was very common in this area in the 1880s, particularly for towns with heavy German German populations in these towns, to have like maybe 4 or 5 smaller breweries in each one. So I guess that raises the question: is the national beer of Texas even Texan? You could say it was transplanted by a company from elsewhere. It was shut down in Prohibition in 1919, but was opened up again in 1940, and by the 50, they were using entertainers like Bob Wills, the quote-unquote king of Western swing, to market their brew. A jingle he had on the radio was Lone Star Beer's the clear and mellow brew. Try it once and you'll agree it's the beer for you. In the 1950s, Lone Star was it was reopened by a group of hill country businessmen. So this time it is Texan. One of the head salesmen and basically the face of the company is Harry Jerzyk, who's from Johnson City. Was even worked on Lyndon Johnson's. Was friends with the Johnson family. So he promotes their because in the 1950s there was still basically the population of Texas was 50-50. Urban rural, but Jerzyk really tried hard to market Lone Star towards the rural market, which was which he had a lot of success with, although he couldn't outcompete other Texas beers like Pearl. By the 60s and the 70s, with the state becoming increasingly urban, Lone Star Beer tried other gimmicks or other marketing lines to try to market their beer once again to this rural market. One of them is their From the Big Country campaign, where they kind of advertise it with this exotic sort of bonanza sort of flair to it. Could you Again, I got one of these commercials from this era for you guys. Yep, that's the one. So this is from 1972. So the quality's a little bright.
This is the big country. In this country, a man grows a healthy lust for living. He also grows one of the world's mightiest thirsts. That's why Lone Star, the beer that's brewed here for the men who live here, became one of the world's finest, lightest beers. To go all the way with the big country thirst.
Wow, thank you so much.
Star, the beer from the big country. The beer every beer would like to be like. That is Lone Star.
That commercial made me thirsty. So another celebrity who was enlisted in this from the Big Country campaign, that's what I call it. Another celebrity was Ricardo Montalban, who was from the hit TV show, what was it called, Pleasure Island, and he was also Khan in Star Trek. But one of his radio ads that he would do, Fantasy Island, I'm sorry. Well, his ad had a general flair like that, sort of like exotic sort of flair. This is a sort of beer that real men drink. So this is what Ricardo Montalban's ad. I'd like to talk a minute about beer. It's a funny thing about beer. Every man has his own choice. Some of us choose beer just because it's there and people drink it. There's nothing wrong with that, but men who live here in the big country have a special reason to drink one brand. I mean Lone Star. It's brewed here for the men who live here, and it tastes great besides. Watch the men who drink it, because it tells the world who they are. Lone Star, with a fresh, clear taste of the big country. Lone Star, the beer every beer would like to be like. Take it from me, Ricardo Montalban. And the beer market was a very interesting place during this era. So some of the different styles of some of the different beers that people drank in Texas. Falstaff was, which my parent, I've never tasted Falstaff. My parents always told me it kind of tasted a little bit rotten, or at least it had that reputation. They had a brewery in East Texas that apparently had like a scandal where there was a rumor that the water they were using for their beer wasn't exactly clean. So it might have been more of a reputation. But there were a lot of Falstaff was a very popular beer. There was you also have Jack's, which was now this beer, what was told to me by Jerry Retzlaff, another beerman who worked for Lone Star, was that Jack's was like the preferred beer of the African American market. And particularly when you go out to a lot of people in the 60s, were crossing the tracks and going out to African American clubs and dance halls, and Jack's was the preferred beverage. You also have Shiner, which was there. The Shiner Brewery has a long history here in Texas, but it's also laws from Prohibition limited how wide they could market their beer. So I believe the law limited basically in like a 150-mile radius. You could only market your beer outside of that range if you produced X amount, which Shiner wasn't at yet. They did have a truck that made daily deliveries up to Austin, though, from Shiner. Schlitz was another popular brand, according to Jerry Retzlaff. Again, Schlitz was the preferred beer for the Mexican-American market. and according, I also got this from San Benito resident and PR guy for Lone Star. He was a friend of Freddie Fender growing up, who I'll get to in a little bit. His name was Hector Guerra. But he told me a lot about Lone Star made limited overtures to market towards the Mexican American market, but couldn't outcompete with Schlitz. Among the Anglo market, Pearl was the #1 beer in Texas in the 1960s, but was more popular in North Texas, while Lone Star was more like the San Antonio and below South Texas beer. Different beer brands, depending on their market, will try to have a personality, and then part of the reason why beer has an allure is sort of like mystique that surrounds it, sort of like this very macho mystique. So this is an excerpt from my thesis. There's a writer. This was from a publication called Pearl, which was like a cultural magazine, kind of like Texas Monthly. So writer Dan Jones described the different, so this was a couple of writers from this magazine took a tour of the Shiner, Pearl, and Lone Star breweries. So this is them talking about who drinks which beer. Writer Dan Jones described the different mystiques surrounding Texas beer, saying that for the earthier types, the Texas beers are indispensable. Lone Star is for the person that takes his earthiness too seriously. A Lone Star career drinker eventually graduates to Pearl. This is far down the road, though, and only the serious image mongers drink Pearl for status reasons. Shiner is a pseudo-redneck favorite, although it also enjoys an equally, if not more, loyal following among oldsters who have drunk Shiner for years. This view of commodity as an expression of your personality is further explained when Jones ends his assessment with a warning. Be careful not to pick a beer that clashes with your personality. The results could be disastrous. Weigh the merits of each carefully, and if you're successful, settle in for a long and happy life behind the bottle. So this was a picture of Jerry Retzloff. He was a former Lone Star salesman and district manager of Austin for the Austin market. I got to do a series of oral histories with him, and through him I met a lot of other people who helped me, who gave me a lot of different insights on this era. This is a picture of him in the 1960s when he started working as a salesman for Lone Star. So the business culture then, very professional. Here's a picture of Willie Nelson when he was trying to make it big in the Nashville scene. Jerry Retzloff was also, in his words, he would describe himself as a music freak. He would go out, he would go out and he was really into the different bands that were playing in the live music venues, and would always try to go out and market his product, Lone Star, to these scenes. Eventually he struck up a friendship with Willie Nelson, and they kind of had like an informal agreement, nothing in contract, but they had a informal agreement that basically said they would help market each other's brands. So this is what they look like in the 70s. So a little bit different. So in the 60s, you have what it became popular to wear jeans, and then and longer hair, and even growing out facial hair, which was unheard of in the business climate before. Let's see here. I think I also have a quote from Jerry Retzloff. In particular, he enlisted through Willie Nelson, he enlisted other musicians in this effort, where they would mention Lone Star, that they drink Lone Star to their friends in live concerts, and would also include homages to Lone Star in their and how much they like drinking it in their music. Out of this, Retzloff, talking about it, said that the real fertile market was the youth market, and that on-premise market where beer was sold in the establishment, in the bar. The Armadillo World Headquarters was the second biggest keg account we had in Texas, and the largest in Austin. The second biggest in Austin was the One Night Lounge, and that was like a dive hippie biker bar. the only in the state of Texas, the only venue that sold more Lone Star beer was the Astrodome in Houston, Texas. So there was a lot of beer coming out of the Armadillo World headquarters. With the start of this campaign, that Retzlaff was able to, he sold this to his superior, to Harry Jersig, after taking a bunch of Lone Star executives to a Michael Martin Murphey concert. Michael Martin Murphey had a song called Cosmic Cowboy Part 1, which had as a line in there that says, Lone Star sipping and skinny dipping. And when the moment he mentioned Lone Star in this venue, all his fans held up Lone Star bottles and let out a big cheer, which convinced the executives at Lone Star to give Retzlaff autonomy and the ability to market the beer the way he wanted. And as a result, Lone Star saw a 40% increase in their sales in Austin during the early 70s. He also had, so I mentioned Jim Franklin and the Armadillo. Here's a picture of Jim Franklin. I got to interview him for my thesis as well. And he started producing. He was the first artist to start taking his armadillos. So once again, the symbol of Austin music, and promoting them with Lone Star. So here's one of his posters that shows the armadillos pulling a wagon going west, or going to the left, in a Lone Star long neck, which was the name that they coined for the bottles of beer. And then another one connecting Texas Gold. You had this oil geyser, which is a Lone Star long neck spouting up, and that's a good representation of what was happening to Lone Star sales too. And the phrase you see on both of those is "Long live long necks," which became the slogan that Lone Star used during this era. Other musicians that got in with this, you have Kiki Friedman, who had he was kind of like this comedy musician. He's a Texas Jew boy. He was basically very raunchy, very like in-your-face humor. I'll give you an example of this. He was voted by the UT campus, by feminists on the UT campus, he was voted the misogynist of the year for having a song called Get Your Buns in the Oven and Your Biscuits in the Bed. And he had other songs he had an homage to the shooter, the UT campus shooter, which was, so he had a very in-your-face, very outrageous sort of personality, which is partly the reason why he ran for governor eventually. You also have Red Steagall and his really famous song "Lone Star Beer and Bob Wills Music," which is still very popular today. Other musicians included Asleep at the Wheel, Jerry Jeff Walker, B.W. Stevenson, Commander Cody in his Lost Planet Airmen. We also have, and I guess the interesting thing with this market, and working through the Armadillo World headquarters, Lone Star cut radio ads outside of the Anglo market. So they enlisted African American musicians like blues guitarist Freddie King and Clarence Gatemouth Brown, as well as the Pointer Sisters, who were originally a country group. In the 80s, they would become famous with the song called, like a pop song called, "It's Raining Men." But in the 70s, they were a country group. They also included, Lone Star also cut ads with Chicano musicians, Tejano musicians like Sonny Ozuna, who was in a very famous band called Sonny and the Sunliners. He also included San Benito native Freddie Fender and Country Roland in different Lone Star ads. Here's a sample, a quote from, I got to interview Gary P. Nunn for this. I did an oral history with him at a coffee shop in Blanco, Texas. So here's the song he cut, which was, interestingly enough, was cut. They did a country version, a blues version with Freddie King, and then a Tejano version with Sonny Ozuna. The song is "The Nights They Never Get Lonely," and the lyrics go, "Dancing in the moonlight under Lone Star skies, in the Lone Star state with a Lone Star high, in the nights they never get lonely. We watch the showers of April grow the flowers in May. We lay our cards on the table, singing songs all day, in the nights they never get lonely. Loving with your lover in the evening breeze, listen to the murmur of the Spanish oak tree. The sweet soul music brings you to your knee, in the nights they never get lonely." So I underline that line "Lone Star High" because the marketing executives told him that line right there really sold the commercial to fans, to music fans. So when I was writing this, I was living up in San Marcos. Since moving down here, I've been trying to connect this. I've gotten a better understanding of the history of the Rio Grande Valley, and I tried to connect my thesis to some of the to specifically the valley, to our cultural history down here. So I guess some of the ads mention the valley. These are like this one from the Cooter Brown Band. This is like an outsider's perspective, like an Anglo-Texan coming down to the valley. So the lyrics go, "I traveled way down south by the Rio Grande, down where the jalapenos are eaten just like candy. We heard conjunto music and watched the senoritas. You'll find a place that's made it great year after year. Long live long necks and Lone Star beer, drinking cold Lone Star and eating hot fajitas. Lone Star beer, from the land of Texas to the places far and near." So an outsider's perspective, the Rio Grande Valley is like a place with fiery food and beautiful women. But compare and contrast this with, this is one of Freddie Finder's songs that he did, "Crying in My Beer" from 1976. "Left my home down in the valley, heading north in my pickup truck. Must have tracked in out of town, out of friends, and out of luck. Since I don't have any here, I'm crying in my Lone Star beer. Tears keep falling down. You're not around, and I'm lonely here." And then his trademark style, what Freddie Fender would always do, he'd always add phrases, phrases of the song in Spanish, and that would always be like the emotional epic of the song. But he was you can't understate how big Freddie Fender, or how successful he was. So he had platinum records on Huey P. Moe's Sugarland Records up in Houston. So he was, Freddie Fender represented in a lot of ways the people moving from the valley, valley residents making it big in the United States. This is Hector Guerra, who's from San Benito, Texas. He was a childhood friend of Freddie Fender, who they used to call. He said growing up, everybody called him Squinty because he would always kind of like squint when he was performing. So this is Hector Guerra. I did a interview with him at his home in Harlingen. This is him talking about the Mexican market. Back then, the biggest competition was Schlitz. That's why we had very little success with the Mexican market, because their warehouse was in East Austin and all the Chicanos drank Schlitz. That was their beer. They would go to the Mexican-American markets in the state of Texas, and they would come into town, and we would go strictly Austin to Mexican bars. They'd sit there and buy them beer, never force anybody. They would never say, "I'll buy you a Lone Star by the bottle." They'd say, "I'll buy you a Pearl," or "I'll buy you a Schlitz," or "I'll buy compliments of Lone Star." Sometimes they appreciated it, and sometimes they didn't. That's how you played the game. But it's all about, you can't, a brand like that wasn't trying to force himself or impose, but trying to, win loyalty or win favor. A big event that Lone Star did with Freddie Fender on April 17th, 1976, they held an event in downtown San Benito called Freddie Fender Day. So this is a map from the was donated to the Freddie Fender papers which are They're in the Dolph Briscoe Museum, which shows a map of this route. You can see on here, Rancho Viejo, which is a resort, Padre Island, where the Lone Star executives were staying for this event. And then there's a Lone Star distributorship down in Farr. Right here you see in the map, and another one closer to Brownsville. But with Freddie Fender Day, they had a giant parade that ended in the high school football stadium that included like a Freddie Fender concert. So this was a big event in the Valley. It was a big marketing event that Lone Star was doing to try to reach the market down here. Here's another map of the Freddie Fender show. Other events, so Lone Star did marketing with radios, with television ads, and with endorsements from musicians. They also sponsored large music concerts. And this included smaller ones, just smaller festivals, local festivals like Freddie Fender Day. They also included these big mega events like Willie Nelson's 4th of July picnics. In 1974, Lone Star sponsored a picnic at one of Willie Nelson's 4th of July music festivals in downtown College Station. So in the middle of the Texas summer in the blazing heat, a large number of people, a large number of young people went out to see Willie Nelson, Jimmy Buffett, Townes Van Zandt, and Kinky Friedman. And Lone Star, taking a look at pictures from this concert, Lone Star's image and brand are plastered everywhere. The next section I have of the presentation are a couple of, I mentioned Sam Yates, who is an artist in the Austin music scene. These are a couple of the posters that he did that were featured in different publications. So this one is called Trail Ride. It's you can see a group of men and women around the campfire eating chili and drinking Lone Star beer. You can see the Lone Star truck in the background. Another one he did, I like this one. This is called the Loch Travis Monster. So this is an homage to like the Jaws movies. So the beautiful woman on the inflatable, she's got a six-pack of Lone Star Light, which they were marketing heavy in the late 70s. And below you can see the giant armadillo. This is one of Sam's posters for the Texas Centennial. So this was in 1986, and you can see different. You can see the armadillo. You can see Susanna Dickinson, who's considered by a lot the. She was one of the few survivors from the Alamo. You can see cowboys, oil rigs, space shuttle, Texas Rangers, the flag in the background, and a Lone Star bottle, Lone Star long neck draped across the front. Yeah, and this was once again playing up the space program in Houston. These long neck bottles were called returnables. They were recycled. They were what they used to do with these in like the 50s and 60s. You drink a bunch and then you would turn them in, recycle them, and you could get normally like a couple cents for each bottle that you returned. So in the same way, just like you return the Lone Star long neck, the space shuttle comes back. It returns. Here's another ad. We're almost done with the presentation. Yeah. Sorry.
We tried. Okay.
So you can look these videos up on YouTube, by the way. But this is a famous commercial from the 1980s.
Stars missing. 30 cases of the National Beer of Texas. He's a fiend. Could you describe the alleged perpetrator? You mean the giant armadillo?
He does?
Well, you seen one 12-ton armadillo, you seen them all. No, he never even touched the popcorn or the pretzels. Just the Lone Star.
Lone Star, the National Beer of Texas. Anything else missing?
Nope, just my roof.
So that was the So that was the, yeah, that's a famous commercial from the 1980s, and that kind of shows notice they're using they call it the National Beer of Texas, and that's not the label they give it. In the 1970s, the slogans that they used were generally like "Long live long necks" or no place but Texas" to market it. But there were a lot of changes happening by the late 70s. There were a lot of changes happening in the Austin music scene, as well as the Lone Star Brewing Company. In '76, Lone Star was Harry Jurczyk retired, and Lone Star was bought out by the Olympia Brewing Company from Washington. And then in 1981, they were sold to another company called Heilemann, which didn't market the product the way that they had in the 70s. They wanted to focus on lowering the cost and some would argue the quality of Lone Star beer, and also using TV ads like the one you guys saw. So they didn't want to market through up-and-coming musicians, country musicians like George Strait or Clint Black. They wanted to do sort of the television and lowering the price. So this led to a lot of conflicts with Jerry Retzlaff and the Heilemann CEOs who Retzlaff described as a bunch of Yankees. There are also a lot of changes happening in the music scene. So a lot of the progressive country stars like Willie Nelson made it big, and they ended moving out of Texas. So without popular musicians in keeping the scene going, young people left for other music styles. Blues was making a huge comeback in the 80s with Stevie Ray Vaughan. Disco, people always remember the 70s as the disco era with Saturday Night Fever. There was also harder drugs also changed the atmosphere in the scene. A lot of people, especially in the at the 1976 Gonzales Willie Nelson picket, a bunch of people got arrested and a lot of fights broke out. And a lot of people blame the use of cocaine, heavier drugs that kind of made people a little bit more aggressive. So with new styles, in the changing scene, it was hard to maintain that personality. So here's one of the founders, Eddie Wilson, of the Armadillo World Headquarters, to show you guys an example of this. In 1978, he ditched the cowboy look and adopted a little bit of like a Hugh Hefner look to open up a disco called the White Rabbit in downtown Austin. So this is writing from the Austin Sun. This is an excerpt from my thesis. In an issue of the Austin Sun, writer John Moore wrote that if Eddie Wilson of the laid-back early 70s days of Armadillo was man well suited for his time, then hardly anything has changed. Today, screaming into the 80s to the accompaniment of high-volume rock and roll, hell's hinges seem ready to come loose, and nobody could be more prepared than Wilson. Gone is the beard and Jim Franklin t-shirt, replaced with a white sidewall haircut, neatly trimmed mustache, a tuxedo, and a ruffled shirt. It's the same haircut I had in 1958, Wilson said, full circle in 20 years. In describing the transition in genre and style from progressive country to disco, Wilson explained that the Armadillo saw the number of places where music is performed grow from 12 to 50. Seems that would hurt. A lot of people talk about there being too many places in town. Therefore, nobody makes as much as they should be making if there were fewer. In one form or another, all these places that have music are theater. There is a similarity in all discos that is impersonal as hell. But the similarity makes it possible for an Osco disco freak to walk into a disco in Boulder, Colorado, and feel right at home. And with that, he's also alluding to Austin begins to market itself. Before, Austin was mainly like it was a small town with a university and the state government, which provided most of the jobs there. But you have other businesses moving there. Austin starts to market itself with its unique music scene as being weird, which it still does today. And with that, the population in the city exploded, and it created a huge real estate boom that in the late 80s collapsed. Also going on in the 80s, this is so I guess some of the Jerry Retzloff wouldn't retire from Lone Star until the early 90s, but one of his things that he did under Heilemann was a second, this is a picture from Lone Star's celebration of the bicentennial. This was a second declaration of Texas independence against the northern businessmen moving into the state and trying to keep people from having fun. They made a giant mock western town. Jerry Retzloff did this with Ray Benson from Asleep at the Wheel, Willie Nelson, who was doing a movie at this time called Honeysuckle Rose. You see a lot of people from this progressive country scene now older and moving on into professional careers, other careers, getting together, signing this Declaration of Independence to celebrate Texas heritage and also being weird. You also have other cultural legacies left over from this. In downtown San Benito, you can still drive by on the highway and see Freddie Fender's portrait on the water tower. So in a way, this whole scene, even though it was a temporary scene, but it still sticks with us in different ways today. Country music is still an integral part of Texas identity, and with it, Lone Star beer. And that's it.